Hi, Karen. Welcome to the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, delighted to chat with you today and get into all things caregiving and self-care with you. The first thing that we always do, though, to kind of kick off the show and get it on a good mantra or words of inspiration, motivation. For years, I've been kind of collecting things that have spoken to me as a family caregiver. And I created a jar for my sister when we transitioned care from my mom to my sister. I just felt like, oh my gosh, this is what a gift I'm giving her. So of caregiving. So I wanted to have something that could kind of make sure that she is taking care of herself too. So that's where this came from. And so people can get the PDF on the website. And there's also like an additional insert, because I used to go travel to see her and I would put more little things in her jar. And whether you create a jar or a box or whatever. But anyway, let's get your quote out here today, Karen, and see what we got for your episode. It says, when something goes wrong in your life, yeah, just yell plot twist and move on. Is that relatable?
Yes, of course.
I know there's nothing like normal about a caregiving journey, I think. And we all kind of learn how to be resilient and to roll with it. And I know we're going to get into your story. So with that, let's get into your story. Share with us a little bit, Karen, about your personal caregiving story.
So in 2011, I became my grandmother's legal guardian, and that included being a trustee, it included her being her healthcare conservator, and it included being her power of attorney.
All
And
important things, yes.
yeah. And at that point, she was in like her early 90s. And the quick backstory is that so my grandmother had, well, she's dead now, but she has three children. My mom, my uncle, and my aunt. So my grandmother had three children, and my mom was the oldest. And my mother and her mother didn't get along. And over the years, there was, a lot of conflict and whatnot. And I can't remember exactly who was the person who was supposed to do all this, but in 2011, they decided, my grandmother's lawyer decided, you know what, I think you need somebody else to do this.
It's Karen. Karen's our person.
And yeah, and so I was my grandmother's oldest grandchild, and I lived the closest. At the time I lived about an hour and a half away from her, but so yeah, that it fell to me. And
About how old were you at this time?
So I am 60 now. So I was like, how long ago was that? 2000.
So an adult though,
not like late 40s. Yeah.
Okay,
Early.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Early 50s, whatever it was. Yeah. I don't do the math quickly. And what's interesting about that, right, is that I remember one of the things that I was most concerned about was like all of a sudden I'm sort of responsible for financial stuff.
Yeah.
Like big financial stuff, and making decisions and whatnot. So anyway.
I think you and I have a lot in common, is that I would say I'm a words person, not a numbers person.
Exactly.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's just like we know where our strengths are.
Right. Yeah. So that's what happened in 2011. And at that point, my grandmother was fairly with it and, fairly good physically. She was starting to have some dementia, and she was obviously in her 90s, right? And was starting to become frail, but she didn't have any major health issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, gosh, I don't know, maybe it wasn't quite a year later. It was probably more like 6 months after I became her legal guardian. She fell in her home, because she was living in her own home at that point. And that's when like everything had to sort of go into high gear in regards to,
yeah. Falls are just like, there's a lot of people start to a caregiving journey. You're not alone there. So I'll put some fall prevention tips actually in the show notes for people.
Yeah, I mean, and she was living alone and she had a two-story home, believe it or not. And um can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, we can always mark
Okay.
it.
Because
Yeah.
I wanted to share. So when she fell miraculously, she didn't break any bones, but she did like do a lot of damage to her skin. And like elderly skin is, very fragile. And that was the cause of most of the problem, that because she ended up in the ICU and,
Mm.
had a bunch of issues that way. But what happened was um she she was downstairs in her house and she had a commode um in like a small little office room downstairs, and she had gone to the bathroom in the commode and then was taking the commode to the bathroom to dump it,
Mm.
and it spilled. And as she said, I slipped in my own shit.
Oh, you can't make this shit up.
No.
Interesting though that she went in the bedside commode, is what I call those things, a portable commode, and then she would dumped it herself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other
Why not just go to the bathroom, I guess? Like I'm
and
sure
the
she's
other
thinking the same thing.
well, I think the commode, I think it was easier for her to sit on the commode compared
Ah,
to the toilet.
got it.
Because she was very fiercely independent, and this sort of plays into that as well, is because what happened was, even though she had a medical alert um pendant, she didn't use it because I think she knew that
She
that
didn't
was
wear
gonna
it.
I don't even know if I think she was wearing it, but she refused to like push the button.
Mm.
And she was there for a good 24 hours before she finally
Ah,
was like, okay,
push
I
the
better
button.
push the button.
What is it? I know she's not alone there either. I mean, at least she wore it and had access to it. Like some won't even wear them. And now there's some beautiful jewelry even that camouflages life alerts. Like I'll put some of those in there too, because I know this is a big issue for people. I'll post it in the show notes because there's a stigma, right, about wearing it. But okay, so keep going. So you become your grandma's caregiver, you're her legal guardian. That and you're the person they chose because mom and she had a strained relationship.
And at that point, my mother and I also were estranged.
You know what the common denominator here is? Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Uh,
and I had estranged myself from my mom at the end of 2010.
okay.
And so it was interesting because as my grandmother's legal guardian, I was required by law to be in contact with my grandmother's heirs, her three children. I was
Mm,
not an heir. I was the legal person. But
mm-hmm.
and so at that point, then I would send my mom and her siblings um monthly updates or whatever, the things that I was required to send. um and just a little side note, I believe that when I became my grandmother's legal guardian, I think that put a deeper wedge between my mother and me, which it was
Mm.
already there, but I think that just sort of pushed it a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, a lot of times when we talk about a lot of difficult caregiving stuff on the show, but I think it's important to also note that sometimes there's all these other family dynamics that are playing into the picture, and not everybody is nice to work with, you know. Um, and I'm sorry that you did not have the storybook with your mom.
You know, I it is my life's work at this point.
Yeah.
And the caregiving aspect of for my grandmother played a role in it, but it was not the big story. It wasn't the main story.
Mm,
And yes, I didn't have a fairy tale. I didn't, my mom and I do not have a Hallmark relationship. And for what it's worth, she is still alive, and we do have a relationship now. I mean,
oh,
we had a
good.
relationship even when we were estranged, but I've done a lot of work.
And we're going to talk about some of the boundaries and things that you have set. Before we head on to that though, was grandma easy to care for? Was she easy to work with?
No. um, and so I kind of went into it blindly, not knowing a lot of aspects about my grandmother, but also, the stories that I had about my grandmother were, my own experience of her, but also the stories that came through my mother's filter about my
Hmm.
grandmother. And to be honest, I was afraid of my grandmother. She was not a cuddly, warm, maternal type of person. I mean, and to be honest, I don't think my grandmother ever really wanted to have children, and I don't think my mom did. And I ended up not having them. So, um, again, not a blame on them, but just sort of a commentary on the lack of women's choices, especially back then.
Yeah, true.
Um, but yeah, my grandmother was a difficult person as well. And the thing that was interesting, I think, that made it easier on some level is the fact that I wasn't her daughter. And I know that, there's when it's the more direct relationship between a mother and daughter, I think the caregiving thing is more difficult if there's already difficulties there.
Hmm.
So having that separation or that, generational, we weren't, what I'm trying to say,
Yeah.
made it easier. And I found myself learning how to have difficult conversations with her in a way that I like, it was like, oh, wow, look at me growing up here.
Growing up in your 40s and 50s, and it's so give us some examples on that, because I'm sure people could be tuning into the show, likely they're seeing the topic and they're like, okay, I deal with somebody that's difficult, estranged, trauma, whatever stuff. What were some of those, like looking back on some of those learnings and those strategies that worked for you? What was something that you could kind of pull out as a nugget?
Well, um, as I said, by the time she died, she had moderate dementia, but it wasn't terrible. And so we could have conversations. Um, and just for what it's worth, she died in 2015, in October of 2015. She had just turned 98 at that point. So we're talking, the bulk of this was like about 3 years, from 2012 through 2015. Um, and in the beginning, she was very angry about the fact. So as I said the story, she fell, she ended up in the ICU, she had to go to rehab. And at that point, I knew it was like, okay, she's now going to go into a care home because this is what we've been wanting, but she was refusing. And,
And now you have
I went.
facts, like you have, this isn't possible for you to live in age in place anymore.
Right. And but I couldn't make her at that point, right? And
Mm.
in conversations with professionals, they were saying that, even though you're her healthcare conservator, you cannot make her until she reaches a certain point that is, deemed, you know,
And safe.
unsafe. And so I remember having someone come in at a certain point to like sort of interview her, and like, and they weren't willing at that point, this was before, obviously before she fell, to say, yep, she has to go. So anyway, she falls
Sadly, you
and
have to wait, right? Until, like, you have to wait till a bad thing happens
yeah.
until to get the, and I think
But it's
is it,
because of her. She didn't want to leave.
yes. So if somebody's in a similar situation, I think where you start with your calls is the area agency on aging could probably point you in the right direction. They might have somebody come out from adult protective services or some organization to kind of to see what the situation is. And I
Yeah.
think the important thing as a caregiver, because I've been through this with my cousin, actually, she was with her parents and needed something to happen with her mom to be somewhere, and she was tempted to clean up after her mom and make it look better. And I just want to say, don't do that. Like, they need to see what it really looks like.
Yeah, and I remember, as I said, I mean, she was fiercely independent. Her neighbors, I think were concerned, and my even my mom, and before I was estranged from my mom, people would call her, and my mom lived even farther away than I do from my grandmother. But there was always sort of this, well, what if she falls? What if this happens? What if that happens? And I remember saying at a certain point, well, then she falls, and then we deal with it. And I think that sort of speaks to one of the main points that I think most people are concerned about or worried about, is that they're going to feel guilty if they don't prevent the bad thing from happening.
Yeah. And a lot of bad things can happen and
A
people
lot
can be
of,
unhappy and so much is out of our control. And sadly, people do should, should, they should all over you about the things that you should be doing, but
yes.
we can't be there all the time.
Right. And my grandmother wanted me to come live with her. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen either. And I did have, prior to her fall, I did have, home instead, or I can't remember the name. I think it was called home instead. People coming and doing groceries and whatnot. But
Like
she
home
was,
care. Yeah.
she was, um, mean to them, and they would quit. And I imagined, like, the thing that's interesting about my grandmother is that she ended up having a lot of money because my grandparents got divorced in the 80s, and um, she never remarried, but she had a very, very wealthy boyfriend who left all of his money to her when he died. So go grandma.
Go
Um,
grandma. Well, talk a little, Karen, like, I mean, I'm got a friend of mine right now. Her mom's laying on the guilt. She lives independently. She's, needs more help. They've gotten somebody coming, I think 5 days a week. And then the adult daughter staying 2 days a week, but it's never enough, right? The mom, or in this
mhm.
case, your grandma, like they always want more. And yet you have a right to like live your own life. But how you've had these difficult conversations, and now she doesn't even want the help that you're organizing to get there. Like, how did you resolve that? Like, what are the conversations? What do they look like?
Well, I don't, it's, is it terrible to say I don't really remember? I think let me put it this way. What I do remember at some point was learning how to have conversations that went something like, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And I understand that that's what you want, period. you know, and not over explaining or justifying or, explaining or defending. There's a great quote. One of my favorite quotes is from a woman named Lisa Nichols, and it's something like this: freedom is, or no, it starts like this. It goes, I don't defend, I don't hide, I don't explain, and I don't, what's the other one? I don't remember the other one. But it's
I'll
like,
find
that's what
it.
freedom is.
Yeah. And you
That's
deserve to have that. Like, you deserve to live your life. Your grandma's already lived this stage of her life. You've deserved to live your stage of your life. You had shared something with me in our preparation that will sit with me probably forever. Frankly, you said you can tell the truth in a kind way, and it's not kind if your kindness doesn't include you. So
yeah.
expand on that a little bit, and how did you
You
get
know,
there?
it's like this. So many times women especially put themselves into situations that make them feel bitter, angry, resentful, regretful, whatever, right? Guilty, all the things we hate. And we do that in the name of love or caring or support. But when we feel bitter, angry, and resentful, that's what we get to feel. It doesn't feel like love. It doesn't feel like kindness. And you know, even if you have a great relationship with a person that you're caring for, you can still end up feeling resentful. And when you do that, that's what that person experiences. They're not experiencing your love or your kindness. They're experiencing your resentment, even if you're like trying to hide it. So it's the energy with which we do things. And if I'm not being kind to myself, or if a caregiver is not being kind to themselves, and I know, as like on the surface, what does that look like, or what does that mean? But I think it probably means different things for different people. But I know that when I show up in that situation, I don't want to be bitter and angry for my sake. Now, I'm not saying that anger isn't ever appropriate. Anger is absolutely appropriate sometimes. It's not about like, oh, those are bad feelings, we shouldn't have them, right? But yeah, like what is the like the one of the quotes I like is um boundaries are your values in action.
Yeah, I love that.
Right? It's like, what do you value? How can I bring that to the table here in support of both of us?
It's a
And
partnership. It's a
you
partnership.
might not like it, but I know that it's in a greater good. And you not liking it, the person that you're caring for not liking it, isn't harming them. Them not liking it isn't harm.
Right. We're doing a lot of things we don't like too, by the way.
Yeah.
So like it's a partnership. Like you are, it's a negotiation. What are some examples of some healthy boundaries that you set, with your mom, with your grandma, like during the States and even now?
Um, it's funny. I don't think I really had boundaries with my grand. Of course, I had boundaries with her, but it was very different, and that was a long time ago. My boundary setting game is different now than it was then. Um, but with my mom, the boundaries are, we don't talk about certain things. And over time, she has learned this, and
What do you say if she starts to bring those up?
Um, no, I'm not talking about that.
That's it.
And
It's
this
a
is,
complete sentence. It's a sentence. Yeah.
and it took me a long time to get there. Sometimes it's a matter like I think this is probably a dynamic your listeners can relate to, right? And it's the gossiping about other family members. And this was a boundary I learned long, like before I was even estranged from my mom, because she would bring up family members that she didn't like, and she knew maybe that I was in touch with them or whatever, and well, how's so and so? Fine. Fine, period. And before that, before I learned this, I would say whatever it was, and I would come off those calls feeling icky and like, but the thing with boundaries is that they are always about our behavior. The other person, like, you cannot stop the person from talking about the thing or asking the questions that you don't want to answer. So then it's incumbent on you to honor that and to know what you're going to do. It's not about controlling the other person or saying you're not allowed to do that or say that.
Right. That's a good point. My mom used to have something. My mom is a lovely person, had a little twinge of narcissism. But she would have her greatest hits album, I called it. And it was like track one, blah, blah, blah. And I would listen to this greatest hits album for a long time until I made a decision that I didn't have to listen to the greatest hits. And I would make up funny things and call them that because that just made the whole caregiving thing more fun. But yeah, we can walk away. We can say no. We can say, and my thing was like, she would rehash the past over and over again. Shoulda, woulda, coulda, blah, blah, blah. So it's out of our control. So she might start going and hitting track 1 or 6 or whatever, but I didn't have to listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, other boundaries that I have, like with my mom right now, and this has been for a couple of years now, is we talk every 2 weeks, and that's it. And I think for some people, um, their mothers are needy. My mom is not needy. And in fact, I think maybe every 2 weeks is too much for her. I'm not sure. But when it came to my grandmother, the boundaries that I had with my mom and her siblings, but more so with my mom than with her siblings, was that my communication, that official communication that I was required to do, um, like this wasn't going to be by committee. I was the one in charge, and I had to own that because they're all older than I am. They are my elders, right? Um, my aunt and my uncle respected that. My mother didn't. um, and
Consistent, which is also my favorite word. People are consistent. They're not
yeah.
going to change.
Yeah, and so, I would have to maintain boundaries around that communication, and, the decisions that I was making were mine and mine alone, and it wasn't going to be by committee. But I remember there's a very a moment that had to do with this whole situation that was very compelling for me, and it pretty much was, it's kind of what tipped it over for me into being like, oh, you know what? This is my work personally, but also collectively. And it was the moment that my mom emailed me asking me a question about my grandmother's trust and how much money was being spent. I don't remember the exact question. And I didn't have an answer. And I knew that I was going to have to ask somebody, in the powers that be up to get the answer. And I didn't answer my mom right away. And before I got back to her, she sent me another email and she said, "How come you haven't answered me?" And of course, I'm adding tone here where it was an email, so I don't really know
Sure.
what the tone was, but
The words
I
had escalated. Yeah.
I
The
perceived
verbiage.
this tone like, "How come you haven't answered me yet? What? Do you have to ask somebody?" And I lost it. I lost it. Not to her, but in my in my own little space. I was like,
Like shaming you for not knowing no,
"Yes." And
not owning your role enough or not.
not knowing the answer right off the top of my head, which and
She
here's
knows your Achilles heel. I mean, that's the thing about mamas and family members.
but here's why it was such a turning point for me was it I had internally I had what I now call the fury, devastation, shame cycle,
Hmm.
which was my mom asks me this question immediately, or then sends this follow-up email, and immediately I am filled with rage, like I am talking rage, and then feeling devastated because the anger that I have is feels impotent, and then shame. And it's partly why I wrote my book. I mean,
Yeah, the current book, because you've
yeah,
got
this
multiple
book.
books.
Yeah.
Yes, You Are Not Your Mother. Hold it up again. We want to see.
It's You
Hold
Are
it.
Not Your Mother, Releasing Generational Trauma and Shame. The
And
shame is the big part
shame.
of the book. But in that moment, what I realized is that I had so much shame in me, and that my mom, like, because of what I was believing about myself and because of what I thought my mom believed about me, which is that I'm basically a pathetic loser who doesn't have answers off the top of her head, right? And that cycle would repeat itself over and over and over again. It repeated itself in my life. I mean, ever since I was a child.
Hmm.
So being able to identify those kinds of things when we're dealing in these kinds of situations, right? Like, oh, look what I am making this mean. Can I blame my mom for it? Kind of, right? But I'm not
But
about the blame.
again, she's consistent. It's going to
Yeah.
happen. So you're recognizing that there's a pattern, and then you're kind of seeing. And then
Yes.
once you recognize there's a pattern, then you can do something
About it.
to about it. But I have a question first, Karen. So, like, one of the things that sometimes gets confusing for me is I get twisted in my head is the difference in the feeling of guilt and the feeling of shame. How do you distinguish those two?
So shame is the belief that at our core, there is something wrong with us. We are inherently flawed. Um, and it's an experience. To me, shame is way more than just an emotion. It is an experience, and it is made up of sensations in our bodies, actual posture, like crumple. It's Shame is physiologically hardwired into us. I talk a lot about this in the book. Um, but and I think at one time, like many thousands of years ago, we needed shame, like we needed an appendix, but now we don't need them. Whereas guilt is rather than I am inherently flawed. It's, oh wow, I've done something that's not in alignment with what I value. I've made a mistake. There's no coming back from an unquestioned belief that you are inherently bad and wrong and flawed.
Right.
You can come back from, oh wow, I've made a mistake. I've done something that's out of integrity with me,
Yeah.
with what
Well,
I
and sometimes
value.
guilt is just we're stretched so thin and we need grace. Like it's yes, we have those feelings because we want to be that person or do that for this all these individuals, but there's limited capacity sometimes. So the guilt is going to creep up sometimes. And yet we also have to give ourselves some grace, I think. Like it can be good and it
When
can
it,
tough. Yeah.
yeah, I there's are you familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate?
No.
He is a physician in Canada who has become very well known for his work about around addiction and trauma. But he has a great quote that goes like this: if you have a choice between feeling guilt and resentment, choose guilt every time. Because, like what we were saying before, like that resentment, like that eats at us. That, like the bitter, that is, you know, it's like we kind of end up having to stoke it to keep it alive, right? We don't want the guilt. It's like easier to feel resentment, but it's also more corrosive. Whereas guilt, if we know how to have grace, right? Like you can come back from that.
Yeah. Like because negative emotions, to your point earlier, are gonna come up. Um, back to shame, you had said, or I saw in one of your recent Instagram posts, it was a quote from Anne Voskamp. We got a lot of quotes today. I love it. Shame dies when stories are told in safe places. And I hope that this, podcast is frankly a representation of how people can tell those stories in a safe place and hear
Yeah.
those stories, and resonate, have them resonate with them. And hopefully it prompts them to live their life differently and to notice the fear, devastation, shame cycle that you mentioned, and that they have a wonderful resource like yours to kind of help them figure out how
Yeah.
to break that cycle.
Yeah, shame is debilitating. I've lived with shame my whole life. I still experience shame. And it's funny, I mentioned to you before we started recording, I had a book event last night and I spent a lot of yesterday feeling shame. And I'm
Mm.
like, I got to use my own tools.
Yes, yes.
And
But
that's the,
that's human. Like we're
yes.
all a work in progress. Like sometimes people say to me, "Oh, you're the happy, healthy caregiver." I'm like, "No, this is the beacon, people. Like I don't call myself this. I'm just, a work in progress, like the rest of the world. That's has the begin with the end in mind, and let's continually improve to try to get there. And while we're trying to get there, maybe we can pull along a few other people because we
Yeah.
feel like this is, a healthy journey to get on." Um, you know kind of going back to some of the boundary stuff too, like when did you know, or in your opinion, when could it be the right time for someone to consider estranging from a family member?
Well, first I want to say I think it's incumbent, or it's helpful, let me put it that way. And maybe is incumbent the right word? It's like our responsibility. I think now that we have, and so many more people are talking about trauma and and how our nervous systems are and how they work and why they work the way they work and how they work to protect us from threats, perceived or otherwise, right? Um, and I just lost my train of thought. What was the question?
About when would you know is the right time to
Estranged,
consider
right?
estranging?
So understanding your nervous system and how you respond to threats is very helpful. And I think that estrangement happens when you are overwhelmed, when your system is overwhelmed and cannot handle the relationship. It's too much for your system to handle. Now, let's talk about guilt and shame, right? Like, but the thing that I've learned over the past few years that has been so helpful to me is to understand that our nervous systems, when they perceive a threat, again, it might just be a perception. It might not actually be like a lion at the door, but that's important to pay attention to. And there's something going on there, and trying to override it or trying to say that's stupid or that's ridiculous or I shouldn't feel that way isn't going to help. It's not going to help you have capacity in your system to now be with somebody who
Mhm.
triggers you. And
Yeah,
the
I
fact
think
of
I
the
think
matter is that mothers and daughters, I just actually wrote a newsletter piece about this. I'm going to put it up on my blog. I'm also going to do a podcast about it. We trigger each other. We perceive threats, and I'm talking about like you're not thinking it. You're not thinking, oh, she said that and I feel threatened. It's happening on a subconscious bodily level. And what happens, I think, with the vast majority of us who do estrange ourselves is that we can no longer, our systems can't handle it.
yeah. I when you're talking, I'm thinking of this analogy of like, you know, you're driving at a fast speed and you're trying to make changes in your life and your systems. And if you're constantly in motion and doing that and living that life and it keeps coming at you, like sometimes you just got to pull over, right? And
Yeah.
so estrangement is kind of like, let's pull over and get ourselves in a healthy spot.
Yeah. It's like, I think, I mean, when I estranged myself from my mom, thought at the time that it was forever. And I didn't know, what was going to happen in the future. Um, and I never, within my work, I never encourage anyone to estrange themselves. But if that is what feels like the right decision for them, I help them do it in a way that's healthy and with the understanding that it might not be forever. For some people, it is absolutely the right choice that it be forever. And, in those cases, it's, when they're, and I don't even want to put like, this is the definition and, if you don't fit this definition, then you're wrong for doing it. But, if there's been significant abuse and the person is unrepentant and doesn't respect you and is never going to respect you, is never going to be open to having a vulnerable conversation with you, you know,
Yeah.
that could, that to me is like, consider that.
Yeah.
And consider also that if you do work on yourself, and again, not to fix yourself, this isn't about you've got to change and become a better person. But what I've noticed for myself is that over time and the work that I've done, I have more capacity in my system to be with my mother. Some people would say she doesn't deserve it. Right? But it's a personal choice that I've made for my own growth. There's been times where I've thought, you know what, maybe not talk
Well,
to
if
her that like.
anything, Karen, you're getting fabulous content to, by having this, by being tested, and that
Yeah,
will help
fabulous
other, and
content.
that will help other people, right? Like, so talk a little bit about your work. You kind of use the word loosely. I know you do some coaching sessions. I love that you call them
Yes.
the mother load consult, LODE, mother load. What usually transpires in these, and what is your work about?
So it's about creating three things: safety, which is kind of what we've just been talking about, right? How can we be safe people for ourselves and for those around us? Which also sort of speaks to what I was saying earlier, right? What is the energy with which I want to show up in this relationship? If it's fear, if it's unconsciously fear and shame, that's what people are going to experience, right? So how do we become safe with ourselves so that we can be safe with others? And again, that's not like you're an unsafe person, but I mean, I would say that there's been many times in my life where I've been an unsafe person for myself, right? So creating safety, creating what I call an intentional identity, which again doesn't mean you got to change who you are. Like, it's more about stripping away the stuff that gets in the way of you being really who you want to be. And when it comes to a difficult relationship with like a parent or a sibling, I mean, it probably can work in a romantic relationship, but again, that's not really my wheelhouse. But it's like, who do I want to be when I show up in the relationship with my mom? And I help people work through creating this intentional identity. And, some people give it a name. I call mine fierce love. And there are three pillars that uphold that identity. And those three pillars, my three pillars, are dignity, expression, and audacity. And each of them has a felt sense. And each of them has little memories or stories or thoughts associated with them. And I have it written down on a piece of paper. All I have to do is look at it and I'm reminded. One of my little sentences for audacity is, I was made for this. And when I say that, right, I have a full body experience,
Yeah,
right?
you could see it. Like if those are watching the YouTube, like it's like, yeah,
Right.
it's
So
like
it's
one of those
things like,
mirror moments. I was made for this, and it's like you believe it in your core.
yeah, yeah. And and so it's helping someone create this for themselves so that they have that resource. And it's based on taking them through their memories of things that happened in their life that they really
Mm.
enjoyed, and then being able to look back on those memories and see, what did I, or ask themselves, what did I see in myself that I really appreciate, or what did I see in myself that was really amazing to me, or courageous, or whatever the thing is. And that's what's so beautiful about it. It's not like, oh, I have to come up with some mantra that I don't believe, right? It's like, I already have it in me. It's a resource that exists within me that I can lean on and count on, so that when I'm with my mother or whoever, right? And again, it's not perfect,
Yeah.
but it
It's a
helps.
different perspective on your past. Like it's a lived experience. And you have kind of had one narration of that
Yes.
you were kind of backing up and shining a different perspective on that. And
Yes.
that's it's clear that you have done a lot of work and that you would be very effective in helping other people, figure reframe this.
Yeah,
And
and then the final piece is, so that creating safety, creating this intentional identity, and creating healthy boundaries. And the intentional identity work flows right into the boundaries piece.
mhm. I love
So
that.
that
Well, we're going to link to the books. And you also have a podcast. What's your podcast called? Tell us a little bit about that.
it's called Dear Adult Daughter, and it is very short. Like the longest one I think might be 20 minutes, but they're mostly like anywhere from like a minute to 10 minutes.
That's lovely. I wish I could make mine shorter. I get so wrapped up in the conversations with people and I was like, but wait, but people can take what they want and leave the rest. Your recent episode was about that, as we're talking, self-forgiveness. What are some of your tips on self-forgiveness?
My recent episode was on self-forgiveness.
I thought that's what I thought it was about. Yeah, self-forgiveness or forgiveness.
I don't think it was.
Oh, okay.
I'm like,
Maybe I
wait a
looked it up.
minute.
Maybe I looked at the wrong one.
Let me
Well,
look really quick. Sorry.
no worries.
I'm like,
And I know sometimes we call it's hard to put a topic on the whole
oh,
episode.
it was about forgiving. Okay. It was about forgiving. It was about why it might be harder for us to forgive our mothers than it is to forgive our fathers.
Interesting.
Yes. And it's, again, I know that that's not across the board, but myself and a lot of women that I've talked to lately have been sort of talking about, like, why can't I forgive my mom? But like my dad, who wasn't perfect and did some shitty things, like, why is it easy to forgive him? And so
Yeah.
that's what I talk about in the
Oh, well, that's a good one. Well, so we'll link to Dear Adult Daughter in there. Well, Karen, I could keep talking to you too, but we're gonna share all the resources of where they can get a hold of you. They can get your book. You have more than one book, but your most recent one is "You Are Not Your Mother," and we'll link to the other ones there. I have written a journal, and I know you're a writer. It's called "Just for You." Daily self-care journal, again, trying with intention, trying to make it intentional for
Mhm.
people to rewire themselves and think about themselves, particularly as caregivers. Is written with caregivers in mind, but not specifically for caregivers. So it's a prompted journal because some people have a fear of what journaling is all about, and
Yes.
so this gives you something to kind of start with. Write a sentence, write a whole paragraph, whatever you want. So, oh, this is a good one for you, Karen. I'm just pulled out some questions. The first one says, do you feel like you are enough? Why or why not?
You want me to answer?
Yeah.
Right this second I do.
Okay, good.
Yesterday, not so much.
And when you feel like you aren't enough, like what is your strategy there? Like,
I
do you
go to
have that mirror?
my intentional identity. And I
There
remind
you go.
myself, I look at it. All I have to do is look at it, and there a bunch of stories come to mind, and I'm like, oh yes, that's who I am.
Yes, that's your character, Karen, identity profile. I love that. What's your latest quick and healthy meal?
Quick and healthy meal. Quick and healthy meal. Well, we've got a lot of kale growing in our garden. And I know kale is one of those things, you either love it or hate it. I love it. And there's a great kale salad. It's not my recipe, but it's very simple. You take the kale, you chop it into like ribbons, and you massage it with the olive oil. You put in lemon juice,
Mm.
cheese of your choice, like grated, um, raisins or currants or dried cranberries, and pumpkin seeds, toasted pumpkin seeds.
Yum. Just in
It's
time for fall. It sounds yummy. I'm a situational kale person, but there's a a Chick-fil-A. Do you have Chick-fil-A where you are?
no.
Okay. Well, they have a side kale. This is a hack that I've been doing recently is they have a side kale salad with like a light dressing on it and some of those things. And then I buy their grilled chicken nuggets
Mm.
and their buffalo sauce and I mix it all together for like a quick meal on the go. So, and I just got hungry.
I
Um,
know, that sounds good.
we're talking about that. Well, that's a good one. What kind of, you talked about how your grandma had some cognitive impairment. What kind of mental activities do you enjoy that help keep your mind sharp?
So I am a avid Words with Friends.
Oh, let's play, Karen. I'm on Words with Friends.
I'm very I'm pretty ruthless. But I'm also I joined I'm a Wordle fan, and Connections on the New York Times. They have another game called Connections, and I love another game called Waffle, which it's all word games.
Yeah, we're word people. We've already determined this. My son got me addicted to Words with Friends during the pandemic. I played years ago and then forgot about it. And then he's like, play with me. And I played with him. And well, he's now gone off to do his own
How
whatever
old
he's
is
up
he?
to. He's 21. And my husband and I are now playing. Sometimes we play each other like sitting in bed, like we're just pinging the Words with Friends back and forth. But it's intellectual self-care. We need that. Like it helps
Yeah.
to keep your mind sharp.
I mean, it's like I like really look forward to it. It's like I get to play.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what self-care looks like. Real, intentional things that we can do that bring us joy and all of that. So, well, I love that. And is there anything else that you are like, we cannot wrap up this call today until we say this? Or do you think we've done a good job of kind of encapsulating?
Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of stories about my grandmother that could have told, because I think the thing I wanted to say is that over that period of time, my fear started to go away and I was able to start having sort of like this intentional relationship with her that was very satisfying.
Yeah.
So,
It's caregiving is not all bad, right? Like
no,
we
yeah.
learn a lot about ourselves in the process. We get these moments with these care recipients that maybe would never have occurred had they not. Like I wouldn't trade it for the world. Was it the toughest season I've lived in my life? Absolutely.
I'll just say some of the stories I share in this book.
Okay,
So
good.
yeah.
Good. And the book is not, for those who are just listening, it's not a huge one. It's a doable.
It's
Um,
yeah, it's in the feedback I've gotten is that the first part especially is fairly intense, because I tell some personal stories that are not pretty. But overall it's a very hopeful and healing book.
Awesome. Well, we need more of that to help with this trauma and the generational stuff. And I'm not glad this happened to you, but I'm glad that you exist, Karen, in the world to help other people fast track through some really tough spots in their life. So thank you for the work that you
Well,
do.
ditto to you. I mean, here we are, right? Doing
Here we
this.
are. How do people stay in touch with you? Like, what's the best way to
Go
stay
to my
connected?
website, kclanderson.com. I am most active on Facebook. And it's everything, all of my social, everything is KCL Anderson. That's how you can find me.
Wonderful. Well, check her out, people. Thank you, Karen, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.